Today on The Real Story, Russia's attack on Ukraine is now in month 2, and Ukraine's president is growing frustrated with the West as the humanitarian crisis worsens and war atrocities are coming to light. This morning, we get an inside look at how Russia and President Vladimir Putin are thought to operate. An in-depth conversation with University of New Haven Associate Professor of National Security and Political Science, Dr. Matthew Schmidt. Plus, attorney Peter Lumage is trying for political office once again. This time, the Republican is setting his sights on unseating U.S. Senator Richard Blumenthal this fall. We get into the issues with him and talk about his unique background. He actually came to the U.S. as a refugee. It's all today on The Real Story. Good morning, and thanks for joining us on The Real Story. I'm Jen Bernstein. Pressure is mounting on the West as Russia continues its attacks on Ukraine. The stories and images coming out of Bucha, a suburb of Kiev, are incredibly disturbing. Wartime, we know, is brutal. But reports say there was a different level of violence there against civilians. We're talking torture, possible executions. Meanwhile, fallout from the findings rippling across the world. We know the U.S. imposed another round of economic sanctions, including against President Vladimir Putin's adult children. President Biden calling Putin a war criminal last week. But we are on month 2 of this conflict, and recently the world has been warned by military leaders that this conflict could drag on for months and maybe even years. So, are economic sanctions enough? Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky doesn't think so. He wants the West to step up and do more than words condemning the war and efforts to impose those economic sanctions. So, we want to talk about it with the director of the International Affairs Program and Associate Professor of National Security and Political Science at the University of New Haven, Dr. Matthew Schmidt. Dr. Schmidt studied in Russia. He has connections there and has written several published articles analyzing Russia and President Putin. Also participated in some of those articles, or interviewed by the writer of those articles. So we want to welcome Dr. Schmidt to the show once again. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay,
I'm well.
So, yeah, we haven't had you on in a while. It's probably been over a year. Of course, I've been waiting to have you on because I felt like at first things were changing rapidly every single day. Now we have changes, but this has become kind of a prolonged process at this point. So let's talk about it. I want to talk about the Russian people right now and what they're being told, because the propaganda that's coming out of the Russian government is pretty shocking to see. What are your thoughts on what the Russian people are hearing?
There's really sort of two groups, two Russian peoples that we're talking about here. The government has been working over the last several months, and especially in the opening weeks of the war, to shut down all of the free and independent media that would have been operating there, including stations, like Fox or like CNN, right? For the first time, and as far as anyone can remember, they're not actually operating out of Moscow. So that news has been expunged from the information sphere. What has replaced it is what's always been there, which is state media in mass media, in radio and television. And for the group of people that are, say, 50, 60 years old and older, that's what they read and that's what they listen to. And they understand that this is a war to get rid of Nazis who are in Ukraine, to get rid of a country that is a direct threat to Russia, that's talking about using biological or chemical weapons against them as they go to bed at night in Moscow, for instance. For people younger than that, particularly 40 and under, and then again in their 20s, it's a little bit of a different story. They get different news. They do get radio and TV, but they also get things on social media like Telegram, or not Facebook so much anymore, but Twitter, right? And ways that information can seep in. And so they have a more nuanced, although still probably not accurate, view of the war. Overall, there's a much bigger sense of dissent, a much bigger sense of unease with what Russian troops are doing in Ukraine than we had expected starting out. Those protests were pretty amazing to see in terms of their size and in how quickly they happened after the war started.
How much does President Putin need public support?
As a political scientist, in the long term, he needs it, right? If you don't have the consent of the public, you will eventually, your regime will collapse. but that could be 20 years from now. In the short term, he really doesn't need it. He can operate on his own as long as he has the loyalty of the security services and is able to then access enough money to purchase what he needs to purchase, or he's already purchased it, and say war materials are already in stores that he can then use to flow into Ukraine. He'd get him into a problem if he needs to purchase things on the outside market, though.
You know, I was seeing continued images of Russian soldiers being really left behind on the battlefield, you know, not even buried, and just left there for dead, their bodies not collected. You know, these are the loved ones of people in Russia, and I can't imagine that that helps give a sense of pride with the war. Of course, we don't think that they're maybe hearing about those soldiers being left behind, but do you have any context to that?
So the Soviet military structure is still what you see largely in the Russian military. When you see these stories about soldiers who didn't know they were going to Ukraine or thought they were on an exercise and didn't know they were going into real combat, that's not surprising for people who look at the Soviet military and how it's evolved or not evolved over time. Higher command simply doesn't trust soldiers and officers down the line. In the U.S., we have something called an NCO Corps, a non-commissioned officer corps, which are your senior enlisted. And they are treated functionally like officers, right? And they often train the young officers that come in to lead them. And there's a good deal of choice and freedom of action that these officers have at the tactical level, and that's just taken away from the Russians. And so they very much feel like they're cannon fodder at that level. There's not this sense of unit pride that you see in the West because there's not this sense of camaraderie, right? These units aren't training together for the same amount of time in the same way that Western units are. To your other point, though, one of the things that's been getting across to Russians more than other things are the soldiers that aren't coming back. The Ukrainians have done this phenomenal thing where they set up a call-in hotline for Russians to call in and ask about their kids, to say, hey, this was my son, he's serving in this unit. Is he there? Is he a prisoner? Or is he dead? And the Ukrainians in that official way have been really gentle, really sensitive to do this, and have understood that doing that supports their cause because it gets the information back to Russia, but also because, again, these are very close cultures. There are millions of Ukrainians living in Russia, ethnic Ukrainians, right, who all have friends and family back in Ukraine itself, and vice versa. So these are deeply entwined peoples.
Were you surprised with this war, with what you know about Russia and what you know about President Putin?
Unfortunately, I wasn't. I took Putin more or less at his word, and I have never thought that this war was about Ukraine being in NATO. If you look at NATO and it's the missile systems that Putin has given many speeches about, if you put one of those in Ukraine, it hits Moscow roughly at the same rate at time that one in Estonia, which is already in NATO, would hit Moscow. So Ukraine in NATO doesn't really change the strategic balance. But what is different is the idea that Putin needs Ukraine to build a kind of manifest destiny for himself, for where he sees Russia's place in world history. And when you have someone thinking like that, you're willing to do some things that looks over the line, that looks crazy, right, to the other side, but isn't, right? It's not that much different than the idea of American manifest destiny and moving out west. But I think that's what's really driving Putin, and that's why he's not easily deterred.
Yeah, it's interesting. You wrote there was a fascinating article in Salon.com that just got published. You sent it to me. You were interviewed by the journalist in that, and you were saying, a lot of people are sitting there saying that President Putin is irrational, that we don't know what he's thinking, and you see it differently. You see him as a rational individual in terms of understanding what his goal is, right? That he has a goal that he's working towards.
Yeah, I think of it in terms of relationships, right? We're all in relationships, and sometimes we think that our partner is saying crazy things, but they have a different logic, and they're following that logic from point A to B to C. So they're not being, crazy, and neither is Putin. And Putin looks out, and he says that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what he means is not the collapse of communism, because he's not a communist. And when President Biden says he wants to rebuild the USSR, he's simply wrong. He's a capitalist, right? It's not the Soviet Union. He doesn't want to reconstitute all those same states and everything that you had in 1972. But what he means is, when that structure of the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia's place as a power player in the world collapsed with it. And that Russia has a destiny, historical destiny, even a religious destiny, to be a player in the world. And not just today in 2022, but in 2400, right? That there is a purpose for Russia to exist in world history. And he uses this idea of Eurasia, which is sort of all of these, most of these areas of sort of the core of the Soviet Union and these different peoples in it, and that they would have a kind of, that Moscow would be the center of cultural and political power. They wouldn't own Kazakhstan like they did in the Soviet Union, but Moscow would be a core center of power, and Kazakhstan would be important because Kazakh culture is Eurasian culture, right? It's similar to Russian culture in this way. But the key in all of this is Ukraine. He has to have Ukraine, or this vision, this project of a manifest Eurasia doesn't happen. And that's why he's willing to go over the line on what we think is rational behavior. And while he'll still be able to keep pushing and drag this war out longer and increase the brutality in it, is my unfortunate guess.
So are the economic sanctions that the U.S. and other countries have imposed, is it enough? Will it do anything?
The thing about sanctions is that we don't do sanctions to do sanctions. We do sanctions because the idea is that hurting a group of people financially will cause them to cause Putin to change his policy in Ukraine. So all of those first parts can work, and they seem to be working really well, right? We have completely demolished the Russian economy. The ruble is a decade behind on where it was just a few weeks ago, right, in terms of its value. We're driving people out of the country because it's getting so hard to live there economically. We're driving investment out. All of these things are also going to hurt Russia for the very long term. But we don't know if it's going to make Putin change his mind. So we sanction his daughters. I mean, that would make me angry as a father, but I don't know that's going to change my mind. It might make me double down. And the thing here is that the oligarchs, these billionaires that sit around Putin, some of them believe what Putin believes, right? So they're willing to sacrifice some money in order to create this manifest destiny, this Eurasian destiny, as sort of the purpose of having billions of dollars in the first place. So what we don't see is that there's this transmission from the effects of the sanctions to the people that are going to get Putin to change his mind. And so I'm highly dubious that the sanctions will, in effect, cause the oligarchs to force Putin to change his mind, if they even could do that. I'm not sure they could do that.
Okay, so at this point, what do you think of U.S. policy and European policy with what's going on in Ukraine? Is there an argument to step in? What do you see happening?
I think there is an argument to step in. But first, I think that American policy has been very good. And this idea of signaling what we know about next moves has been highly effective, and it's very unique. We've never done that before. And so I think in general, the administration gets high marks for this. That doesn't mean that it works, though, because it's not really in the administration's control in the end. It's in Putin's control, right? He is controlling what in the military you would call operational tempo or op tempo. He's driving that, we're reacting. The only way that you get control back on that op tempo from NATO's standpoint is to engage in operations, is to do something like force a humanitarian corridor in the southeast, into Mariupol, although there are few people there left to save, unfortunately, or to force a humanitarian, a safe haven around the Lviv in the west, and to force the other side to react to you. Ukraine can force Putin to react to their military moves, but it's going to be much more difficult for them because they just don't have the power.
Interesting. But if the West at some point does step in militarily, is that what you mean? The repercussions on that could be really World War III at some point, right? Maybe.
Again, I think Putin controls the narrative on this, and he controls the operational tempo. He's constructed a rationale in his mind for why he would interdict NATO forces anyway. He has plenty of reason to attack the bases in Poland where the military, weapons, the goods are sorted out there and put on trucks to come into Ukraine. right? There's no reason he doesn't attack that, except that it's not in his interest right now. So I don't think that doing more will necessarily increase his reason for attacking NATO. I think that I'm not advocating that NATO troops roll in an active sort of offensive way, but I do think there are ways that we could use our military power to push in humanitarian assistance in a more muscular way, right? Sort of pseudo-militarized. We can come in and we can protect an area in order to then allow humanitarian aid to come in, allow those workers to come in who would be military,
right?
Right, to get people out. And I think that's important because Putin's lever, his center of gravity of power is holding civilians hostage. It's holding cities hostage. If you take that away from him so that he cannot hold cities hostage, then he loses a lot of the power he has to shape the endgame.
We've run out of time, but I want to make sure we get this in because I know you wrote about this in that Salon.com article, or you were talking about it in the article. How concerned are we about weapons of mass destruction with Russia at this point?
It's something to be worried about. It's a non-trivial concern because given how he thinks about this situation, the use of those weapons might be necessary to achieve, again, this manifest destiny that he needs. Deterrence doesn't play the same way when the person on the other side is thinking in these quasi-religious ways. And I think we do have to be worried about that, yes.
All right, Professor Matthew Schmidt, always good to hear your perspective on this. You have so much experience. I had put this in, but didn't get to say it. You were a professor of strategic and operational planning at the Army's Command and General Staff College as well. So you've taught, sounds like, military tactics at points, military policy.
Yep.
So certainly appreciate your perspective, and you're welcome to come back on. I want to have you on definitely again because we didn't even get to half the topics that we could touch on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
All right, coming up on The Real Story, we turn our attention to the U.S. Senate race in Connecticut. Senator Richard Blumenthal up for re-election. Attorney Peter Lumage is running as a Republican. It looks like could be headed to a primary, possibly, because he's not the only Republican interested in taking on Blumenthal. We'll have to see. We're going to hear his views and what he thinks he could bring to the job. Peter Lumage is on deck. Stay with us.